Hello, welcome to the Sega Mega Master Show. Today we have a very special guest, ex-Sega employee, Erik Wahlberg. Say hello, Erik.
Hey guys.
Great to have you
Hi.
here, mate. Great to have you here, Chief. We've got, as usual, lads. We've got Viraj, Rick, Steve. We all right, chaps?
Good as can be.
Yep, ready to go.
So we'll get straight into it. And first up, we're going to have Rick asking his first question to Erik.
So, Erik, video game tester sounds like a dream job to us. Were there any aspects of the job that made it any less dreamy?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you kind of what was so cool about it first, and then tell you what wasn't. I happened upon Sega and testing because a grocery store I worked at for 7 years closed down, and my buddy, who is a serial slacker slash temp worker, happened to be working at Sega as a tester, and he said, "Hey, come on in." And I said, "Well, okay, whatever. I figured it's going to pay low, and I need to go back to making grocery, work in the grocery store." So I walk in there, and right away I was blown away with just the atmosphere and all the imagery, the Sonic stuff, and everyone had, there's people had plushy characters in their cubes, and I hear all the sounds of all the video games, T-shirts people are wearing. I was like, "Oh, this is pretty cool." And the thing I remember that was so cool about the very first experience was this is a time when Sonic 2, they were working on getting that out. And they had a lot of people coming in like me. And they didn't have space for us. So they put me sitting on the floor with another tester. We were playing Streets of Rage 2 for the Game Gear. And we played for, several hours. And we're writing down, notes of issues and things we saw. The other tester was kind of guiding me for things to look out for and how to make the notes. But at the end, I'm like, we get paid for this? It was like crazy because I had a blast playing co-op Streets before on a game that wasn't even out yet, right? And from then on, I was like, wow, this is really a cool thing. And I could tell you more about how I transitioned from tester to producer, right? But that was the cool part. And there's many cool parts of between being able to go on some offsites and being privy to some previews of things before people could see it. But the stuff that sucked was that it was still a job, and you could walk in one morning and maybe you're working on, say, Jurassic Park for last week. And given it was a hard game, but back then it was still had a lot of really cool aspects to it for us, like the testers like to play it. And I walk in and I see Little Mermaid for the Game Gear. And I'm stuck on that for 8 hours, day after day after day. And on top of that, see, here's the thing. It's not free form playing. What you do is you have a test plan, and they say, play level 1 on this difficulty and, check out these aspects of the game. And so I'll be maybe just playing level 1 all day and just rebooting. And so it definitely could be a job, right? It definitely could be a job. I would say in retrospect, even the crappy parts are pretty cool. So
Yeah.
Now, just on that then, Erik, when they had that format, that setup, do you think that actually worked for the games themselves? Because part of me wonders if that kind of setup would affect the overall dynamics and pacing of the game.
I'm not sure I understand the question exactly. Can you reform that?
So if you're playing one level all day,
yes,
then whereabouts in the process does it come when you piece all that together? Later on down the line, would you be assigned basically, the job of just playing through the full game continuously?
Yes, yeah, certainly. So part of the test plan was broken up right over a period of several days and weeks over dozens of testers, and they would make sure that almost everybody would play through the whole game at a point. And sometimes it'd be like, oh, this is an area that they found the most bugs, and so they have you play that a lot. Or this is an area that we already have people looking at level 2 and level 3, so you're going to do level 1. And so it was really just a matter of being thorough. There wasn't a lot of time, to be honest, where I was stuck on a level, but there were certainly things you had to go out of your way to do to check off those boxes, which were good because back then, as you guys know, the best you could do would be to rev a game, get a revision of it. You would release the game, and then if there's a really bad bug or a bug worthy of it, the next batch of burns they would make would have the fix in it. But you could not do like nowadays and say, hey, here's Cyberpunk. I know it's not done, but play it and then we'll fix it in a year. So their test department at Sega was top notch. Like, yes, there are some games that have bugs, but I promise you there are a lot worse bugs and many more bugs before we shipped it.
Spot on, mate. Spot on, mate. Lovely. Right, Steve, you're up next then, Chief. Your question, buddy.
Okay, Eric. We've all watched a lot of the console war, documentaries, and so we all know who like the really famous people were at Sega. But we don't get to learn who everybody was at Sega. When you were working there, who were your favorite people there to work with that we may not have heard of?
Yeah. So, you mean obviously just a lot of my coworkers, right? So when I was in Sega Test, I had some kind of my buddies, and
Right.
a fair amount of those people did go on to work in various video game companies. My assistant producer, David Gray, has been an executive producer at Zynga for 10 years. I could go on with many. Bill Person, who is a producer in a group with me on the Omega team. He works at, I think, still Microsoft. And so it's pretty cool to see how they all evolve. But to answer those questions you just asked me, some of the people that maybe you didn't hear as much about, they're maybe a little more influential. You guys know the name Mike Latham, maybe. So yeah. So in a way, Mike Latham is worth talking about for a second. A couple ways. One is that he gave me my break, and I could explain that later if you guys want to hear the story. But he gave me my break to get in to become a producer and have a 30-year career. But he was someone who shunned PR. He would send me to do PR all the time. So I was like the PR boy, and he was always like hiding in his office and didn't want to talk to people. He would talk to reporters in his office without pictures and just give them like quick answers and send them off. So a lot of people didn't really know that he's the guy that did, Eternal Champions and really drove so much of production. He was kind of ultimately in charge of the test department, and he was part of a lot of decision making on the roadmaps and things. And so he was a pretty big player, was Mike Latham, and he was my boss. And he's somebody I love to work with. He was difficult in that he wanted the best, like a lot of kind of type A driven people, but he also wanted the best games for our players, right? He was very passionate about that, which is very endearing. And then my coworkers on that team, because we all made games together, some people that are kind of the more famous people again, or should be famous, Tony Van and Rhonda Van. So Tony and Rhonda Van, they both were at one point like SSI, and they did some of the Gold Box D&D games, as well as the BattleTech game for SSI, which is pretty well-known, well-received games that are still played today. And then they come over to Sega and I worked for each of them at one point. And I'm actually still good friends with them. They live maybe 10 minutes from me. And those guys were great. I mean, sweetest people in the world. I mean, literally, there's no one nicer that I know in the industry than Tony and Rhonda.
I seen an interview. Adrian did an interview with Tony Van recently, didn't he?
Yes.
Very nice.
Yeah,
very
he
nice.
Finally got him for like 3 years. I think he was asking him to interview. And then who else? Yeah, I mean, Ed Annunziata, that I don't know how famous he is to you guys, but he's, Echo the Dolphin. Super chill guy, so nice. And I'm still friends with him. I actually worked with him briefly in 2016. I stay in touch with all these guys. Who else? In general, I would say that what was cool about Sega back then was it was before it was like super corporate. It was before everyone's coming through design school and just barging in and making video games. It was more like, wow, this is really exciting, this thing we're doing. And a lot of creatives were kind of a part of the process, and not as many suits, with looking at metrics and data to decide everything. So it was really a good environment in general with a lot of cool people.
Nice. Do you miss it, mate? It sounds like
Oh yeah. So I tell people this a few times, my 2 favorite times in the industry, definitely Sega, because if you think of like a movie that you saw as a kid that is still remembered to this day. So when I was 9 years old, I came in the theater and saw Star Wars, knowing nothing about it. And so I'm like, right. So life changing. And you remember that was a wonderful moment. So working at Sega, I walked in the door just as Sega was overtaking Nintendo, it was fairly brief, but it did happen. And so the energy level was high. Tom Clancy would give these great quarterly reviews. We show all these super funny commercials, if you remember those, and show how great we're doing with our numbers. And then we're making these products. Hey, that's the game I worked on. It was just super. We had budget. People were just doing well and happy. It was just really a good time. So I loved working at Sega for many reasons.
Nice. I'm saying, I mean, that's kind of covered some of Rick's next question. But I don't know if there's any more. What do you think, Rick?
Actually, yeah, my question was more of a continuation of Steve's question is who were your favorite people to work with? I was going to ask, were you still friends with any of your fellow game testers? But you actually kind of answered. So I have another question that I can ask in the place of that one, though.
Go for it, mate.
Okay, so how often did the Japanese English language barrier come up, and was that an obstacle? And did you have to learn any Japanese?
No. If I had learned Japanese, then I probably would have been fired. So there was Ryoichi Hasegawa, or Hasegawa-san, was the Sega of Japan producer who worked directly with all of us, who spoke great English. And he was the guy for everything from here's a new build of the Japanese game, and here's some things to talk over, or if I need to express something to him. So we had our translator all the time. And he was great. And so there's never an issue that way. If anything, I think that at a corporate level, there was more of sometimes them not getting it because they have the Sega of Japan and Japanese kind of game culture themes and what they value versus the stuff that we did to market the game and be successful on our side, right? Because Sega, if we talked about, Dan, we're talking on Messenger the other day, was about how Sega was so cool, right? Like that was not Sega of Japan's kind of marketing direction. Not that they weren't cool, but we were like all in. We're like, we're edgy, we're cool, Nintendo, right? And so, so I think that was the biggest kind of barrier, was when we would pitch product to them, or if they wanted to make a decision to support a product or not, they were more Japanese centric in their thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
You could definitely see that as well with how things evolved. I think I'm only speaking for myself, but obviously speak to the lads there, and that more American approach definitely, appealed to me as a person. Yeah. And I think the group of lads, it made a big difference, mate. It made a big difference.
Yeah. And by the way, if I ever answer any of your questions without really answering what you wanted to know, feel free to follow up. That's not what I wanted to hear. So just let me know.
Okay, sure.
Well, we'll move on to Viraj then, Chief. What's
all right.
Your question, chap?
Oh, this is a light one. So as time has gone on, we've seen pictures emerge online with Michael Jackson coming down to Sega to play, and I saw a picture with Tupac and Suge Knight, all these celebrities coming down and all that, and all that stuff. Did you get to meet any of these celebrities? Did you get to hear any stories, even if you didn't meet them?
Right.
Who are the main sort of in the culture of the 90s? We had a lot of celebrities. Who are the main people that used to come down and you'd meet, who were not necessarily celebrities? I mean, you mentioned Tom Kalinske, a big name there.
Right.
Anything memorable of that period that you can shed some light on for us?
Yeah, 100%. So, so far as people just coming in, and I maybe I didn't even know they were there that day or something. So at a point we had Joe Montana football, and he came by. Mostly, I think straightly to the corporate offices. Probably. I'm a big Joe Montana fan. If you guys don't know, from American football, the 49ers and the Chiefs, but people like him, and then we worked on some boxing games as well. The was it Greatest Heavyweights? Is that the Sega one?
Yeah.
And so Joe Frazier came by. I would have loved to have met him, but I didn't even know that he came by. I think it was like a day I had off, or maybe I was working the night shift and he came during the day, whatever it was. But the two ones I can kind of tell stories about was Michael Jackson came by, I think probably a couple times. And one time he came by and he was going to get a tour of Sega. And, it was like complete lockdown of behaviors. Like, our manager's like, stay in your cubes, don't pop your head up. Don't walk up to him, be cool. Right. But he ended up coming when my shift was already over. And so, because we had morning and night shift, and my buddy Harry Chavez, who's my best friend there for like 6 years, and we both wanted to see him, because we're young enough. We're like, I just want to see him, right? So we knew he came in through the front, and so we parked the car right in front, facing the front doors, just waiting for him to come out. And maybe like, I don't know how long, an hour later or something, one of the QA guys, the test department guys, comes out and he sees us and he's like, hey, what are you guys doing? And it's like, oh, wait for Michael Jackson to come out. And he goes, oh, actually, he went out the back door.
Oh, man.
which makes sense. He probably always goes out back doors everywhere he goes, right? so I never physically saw him. And then MC Hammer was another one. And this is one again that I didn't get to see him until the very, very end. The funny story was that, and I have been told that I got this a little wrong because it's kind of secondhand, but in its basic story, it is true, is that he came in and we had one of our QA guys named Keith, I forget his last name now. I'm Japanese American, but he was the best guy we had at Joe Montana football at that time. And I think it was the Sega CD version or something. And MC Hammer, I guess, played in college football or something. He was a big fan of that game. And so he said, okay, I'll play you. And he just completely destroyed Keith. Like, it was like 60-3 or something. It was like just obliterate him because, he knew how to, he was bumping, doing things that in real football you couldn't do, like with his defensive backs and things. But in essence, he just destroyed him, which is hilarious because you would think like the best QA guy who plays the game all day would, but he didn't. And then it was fun. Was that?
No, that's brilliant. That's fantastic.
Yeah. It was pretty funny. And then so to follow up with that, how I saw them was, again, it seems like everything always happened during the day shift, and I was working the night shift. But I saw his. It's not a DeLorean, but his sports car. It might have been a DeLorean, but it was some fancy Lotus type, car. And he got in it, and I think it even says like Hammer on the back or something, which is cool. But he had this huge bodyguard with him, right? And the bodyguard, like I could see his elbow sticking out the side, like it's just too small for him. But he's in this little 2-seater, right? So it's just kind of funny. He's like me and my giant bodyguard in my tiny sports car. And so those are kind of the two. And I had some stories from like Electronic Arts later where I got to meet a lot of boxing folk because I worked in some boxing games. But at Sega, those are my Sega celeb stories.
Thank you. Nice. Thank you very much for that. It's very nice. Thank you.
Brilliant, mate. Brilliant. That sounds brilliant. I still get my head around that with MC Hammer beating him on Joe. That's fantastic. Yeah. That's fantastic.
I said, please, Hammer, don't hurt him.
Hey! Right. Well, we'll move on then, mate, to the games and the systems then. So my question first of all with these. Okay, which Sega game that you worked on excited you the most, and would you say that you felt most passionate about?
Well, that's a super easy answer for me, as you probably know, which is Eternal Champions. This one I could take the entire 2 hours talking about that game, but it starts from the beginning, and I'll truncate things. You just ask me questions if you want me to tell you more, right? But essentially, when I was a tester, I was walking by a cube of Michael Latham, that exec producer, and he had all these pictures up of all these fighting game characters I'd never seen. And the art was by the way, a guy named Ernie Chan, who worked at Marvel, did Kona Comics. But and then he had stacks of martial art training tapes. And I was also like, this is 1993, or 2. And so I was big Street Fighter guy. And also I've been doing martial arts since I was like 13. And so I was like, hey, this is super cool. if you want me to, put some free time on the side to like give you some feedback or be involved in it, I'd be happy to. And that was just because I was excited. I was not thinking about my career or anything. And he was impressed. And so he gave me opportunities to be like first the game balancer, and then be an on-site tester. And then eventually I became assistant producer, etc. All throughout that time, Eternal Champions as a tester all the way up until 95. So almost 3 years, about 3 years, I was working on either Eternal Champions Genesis or the Sega CD version. And I did a lot of design work on the Sega CD version, my first design work on it. And I was really, really proud of that game. It pretty much was the game that I had hoped it would be. Problem being, several problems with Eternal Champions Sega CD was that it came out way late and on a system that was already competing with the PlayStation, and it was like, forget it. So it didn't do well so far as money and numbers, but it did get good reviews. If you retrospectively look back at like a lot of the gaming magazines, most of them liked the CD version. So that one I was super passionate about. I got to do press tours for it. I got to design, the updated combat system, several of the character movesets, and just be involved in what was such a fun game for me, which was, it's a fighting game, right? And we had budget to actually make it decent. So that to me by far is the one I was most passionate about.
Very nice. Very nice indeed. I mean, to me, I think you mentioned that what you say about the timing of that. It is a shame because to me, you had Street Fighter, you had Mortal Kombat. Yes, there were other franchises like King of Fighters and whatnot, but really, it was Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. And for me, Eternal Champions really had potential to carry on as a franchise. Had a few timing, release timings, and a few bits and bobs been changed as it had grown really. So it's a shame that didn't happen.
Yeah, I'm thankful that because back in 95 when it came out, we would not be thinking that, well, I can't wait until 28 years from now when we can be on a live stream and talk about this, because it didn't happen. Like there was like stuff in print, stuff we talked about on some interview, but you're mostly commiserating with your friends, right? It wasn't really, but now all these people, as I think you guys know that retro gaming kind of has resurgence. Have you guys aware of this? Cool. And so we all get to talk about it, and I see so many videos, retrospectives on ECCD and the Genesis version as well. And a lot of people were commiserating about how much they liked it. And it was a smaller subset of people because not a lot of people played it, but it was cool. Something else I'm proud about that game. And by the way, this game was 95% Michael Latham, so I don't want to say it was my game. But he did let me do a lot of design stuff that I think make it a better game for CD. But what I was proud about was that games like Street Fighter and Portal, so many of these games, they had huge teams, and many years to develop these systems. And we were basically like okay. We were like, kind of figuring it out. And so I was proud about how fun and competitive that it was for a game that we really, we just had to start running from the beginning. We couldn't really sit there and iterate and do pre-production for 4 years, right? So that's that.
The thing I love about Eternal Champions, what you try to do with it, is the fact that everything around at the time, I'm talking Street Fighter, Battle, games like Battle Master, and more obscure one-on-one fighters, all tried to copy Street Fighter 2's moveset, Tough Enough, games like that. Whereas Eternal Champions very much did its own thing, didn't it? And that I thought that was so respectable, so fantastic. When I played it, it was like a fresh game. When I played all these other fighters, King of Fighters, Tough Enough, Battle Master, they were just pure Street Fighter 2 rip-offs. So definitely, the Sega team definitely deserve big credit for that, mate. Definitely.
So for what it's worth, I just want to say it was featured on the Mega Drive Mini. It was on the Genesis Mini.
It made it in there, huh?
Yeah, it made it in there. The Genesis version was on there. So out of all the library they could have chosen, they had 42 games. Eternal Champion is one of those games that featured it. So it must have been good for something.
That's huge.
There you go. So just it's commiseration, but it's hey,
Yeah.
it's there.
That's good to know, because I've seen several like best of, discs and things that have come out over the years, and it was never EC, so that's cool to know. Something I'd say though, I don't know, Dan, how much you played the CD version, but what I tried to do, and I don't want to go too much in nuts and bolts, but at least you can get behind the thought process and stuff. So we had, of course, our our key or inner strength system that you would burn up when you would use some moves because they were simple to use. Right. The idea is that you just press 3 buttons, you do moves. So obviously the counter to that is you need to have some chi energy to execute that move. And so, but of course the other person could taunt you and things, which we didn't really ever, I think, balance that part too well enough with taunting. But where I'm getting at was I said, okay, we're going to have some moves that are like for everybody. And then I did introduce some quarter circles and some half circles for moves that are much more dynamic, that are much more like, you're doing like a cartwheel move and it's turning into a dragon and hits these areas and just, works as like an air defense or whatever. So we did mix them both.
Yeah.
And then we had a Killer Instinct on site at the developers, because I worked there for several months on site. And so that's where the power combos came in, if you're familiar with power combos. So there's a little bit of like identifying that you can have these special moves that you might not be able to do if your inner strength is too low, then allow them to have moves they could always do, which are this kind of Street Fighter moves, and then combine that with this like kind of really fast combo system for the power combos. So it's a little bit of everything. So yeah, but Michael Latham's original concept, exactly what you said, Dan, which was, I don't want to do what Street Fighter did. And so in that case, I 100% agree that it did stand out because it didn't try and just have the same moves. And in fact, a lot of other games literally try to do exactly the same moves. Yeah. Everybody's got a dragon punch and everybody's got, the fireballs or whatever. So
spot on, mate. Lovely. Right then, to Steve again then next. He's up with his next question.
So my next question is more of coming from a player's perspective, your player's perspective, being a game player as well. There was a lot of developers for Sega Genesis games. Who was your favorite? It could be first party, but third party wise, who would be your number one that you liked the best out of all the choices that we wound up getting for the library?
Yeah, I'm certain that I will miss some developers because I was not always paying attention to who was making the games. As long as it's the publishers, and that confuses you too sometimes, versus the development teams. But one of the big ones that stands out, would be Treasure, Gunstar Heroes. Loved. Was it Guardian Heroes?
That was a Saturn game.
That's Saturn.
Yeah. So I love Guardian Heroes, which is also theirs, and then even Dynamite Head was pretty fun. So they had, and I'm pretty sure they're still around, which is crazy. We
love the McDonald's game.
Oh, did the McDonald's game? Was it good?
Treasureland Adventure.
McDonald's Treasureland Adventure, yeah.
Was it any
It's actually a really good platform.
Very good. It's surprisingly good, yeah.
That's awesome. That's so awesome. So so I like Treasure. But I had so many of the games that I like I think it was Bitmap Brothers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Smash TV.
Yeah, and then they did Soldier of Fortune, right? That was theirs.
They also did Chaos Engine.
That's it. Soldier of Fortune is Chaos Engine.
There we go.
Same game, different release.
Okay. Yeah, and so that's where, like I said, I'd have to do my research to be like, oh, these specific developers, because I like this game and that game and this game and that game. But Treasure was always quality. And then working with, because we're still talking, the 16-bit era, working with would be Sega Interactive, the guys that did Eternal Champions. They were super professional. They were super hardworking. Nobody had any life when we were making either of those Eternal Champions games, which in retrospect, I guess there's some value because people like the games. But then when you look back in your life, like, oh, I could have been having a life back then. But they all worked really hard and they're all talented. And some of them, like John Brandstetter, who was the producer on site there, I helped manage the team. He and I were just talking the other day, and so he's still in the industry, and so that I like Sega Interactive as well. But there's so many good games out there that'd be hard for me to pick my favorite developer.
Fair enough.
Thanks.
Cool. Well, we're going to stay with Steve. He's got another question on games, so go for it, mate.
All right. Your top 5 list of greatest Sega Genesis games that you played or worked on. What's your
Yeah,
top
yeah.
5?
Yeah. So I'm mostly, I think mostly I'm going to talk about the ones that I played. I mean, I think either if the games I worked on were really good at Sega, they were probably, Japanese ports that I had some effect on, but I didn't make them, so I can't take credit for that. And then Eternal Champions is one I said I was proud of. But I'll talk mostly about games that I played, and there's a lot. I think I'll bring the ones to mind that came up right now. So I love co-op games. My buddy Harry Chavez and I would just like hunt voraciously for good co-op games, because there's nothing more fun than everybody wins, just having a good old time. And, oh man, that thing just happened and we just made it. We cleared the level. Good job or whatever. So Zombies Ate My Neighbors.
Oh, brilliant.
Okay, it's a good game.
Played that sucker all the way to the end, and it was just brilliant. Even the very end, the credits, you walk around the offices and they have cartoon versions of all the developers. You get to visit them all. So that was a great game. I mentioned Soldier of Fortune, and I had played it maybe a couple of years ago on one of the emulators. It didn't hold up as much as I remember it, but I can imagine back then how it was still really cool. So I love Soldier of Fortune, again, co-op.
Who was your favorite character in that, Eric?
I think it was the guy that had that kind of like a machine gun. I remember the names now.
The Navi.
What was that?
The Navi?
Might be. Yeah, like I said, like I did play it, but maybe for like 20 minutes when I played it last time. But I mean, I know I played it a lot, and we went through all the different characters. There's a guy that tossed bombs too, right? There's like the bomb maniac guy.
The thug. He was the thug, I think.
Yeah. So, but I just have really good memories of playing that game with my buddy, and it was just the right difficulty. Like it was pretty tough, as I recall. So Madden football, which is like, it almost seems like a throwaway kind of answer, but because as a big football fan, meeting video games, meeting what was back then the best football video game, and then playing co-op with my buddy, like it was the best thing in the world. Like we'd take turns being quarterback and stuff, and we played seasons of that every single year it came out. And then let's see, I did write a couple down. Can't even read my own chicken scratch now. Oh, Snatcher. Love Snatcher. Yeah,
Okay.
that was so I've always had an affinity towards like grittier games, which is why I'm not a huge Nintendo fan, even though they have some amazing games. There's no doubt, but anything that just feels more gritty and more like a movie or more intense or a mature, like I'd always go for it. Snatcher like blew me away, because that one was like, whoa, this is like, it's like playing through a Japanese anime that's rated R. So
Blade Runner.
Yeah,
It's like Blade Runner very much. So yeah.
Yeah, it was great, and it's good timing with that too, I guess. So and then later on, Resident Evil, right? Now we're getting out of Genesis, but that was another one that kind of just when PlayStation 1 came out, that was like, whoa, this is like amazing. But I should go back to Genesis stuff.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, but there'd be a big list, like Fire Pro Wrestling. Was super fun. We would play at the 6-man, battle royales at work. And I will say one thing I guess I'll add about Eternal Champions. What was cool about it to me was during development, I would have all the QA department over, because at that time I was an assistant producer. And so I'd have them all come over to my place, and there'd be like 30 of us, and I'd barbecue, and then we'd play tournament. So in Sega CD version, you could do a 32-man tournament, and we would literally, like, each person would have a character, and we would go all the way down to one as we're all eating, and we're cheering each other on the big screen TV. And because of the fact that Eternal Champions had kills in them, it amped the excitement level. When you see the guy about to get knocked off the boat, everyone's going, shark, 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 shark. And then you knock him into, hey! So that was really great memories, in a game that I'm still enjoyed.
Nice. I mean, one thing that surprised me there quite a lot, actually, Eric, is that you've given that list of games, and there's no role play games. Being a D&D man.
Yeah. So I didn't include Shining Force, which I loved but I mostly like American or European RPGs.
Yeah.
So like I played the Gold Box Dungeons and Dragons games in the 80s, and those were pretty accurate emulations of the D&D game, but with all kinds of art and playing by yourself and tactical combat and stuff. And I would play a lot of those, wizardry, all that said. So I have a list of like non-Genesis games. I would usually play PC if I played a role-playing game. But, later on, certainly like Final Fantasy and then all these other great RPGs that came out, I did play those later.
Cool.
Yeah,
Nice.
2 Konami titles in that top 5, so that says something for them right there.
Yeah.
Didn't mess around.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Good spot, mate. Good spot. Right, we're back to Viraj then. His question next.
All right. So my question is, did you have any standout conflicts, such as playing and testing a game that you knew wasn't good, but you had to test it and green light it anyway?
Yeah.
Was
So
that
we
ever
didn't have.
something-
Okay, let's finish.
No, I'm saying was there any controversy around that? That's basically it.
So it was if you didn't know as a tester, you figured out pretty quickly that we didn't really have any power, and it was maybe the not even the test leads. It was more so the test managers who, if they really think something's an issue, they could bring it to the producer. But our power was basically we would write our bugs and they would be graded from C to A, C being like a graphical issue, B being like gameplay that you may or may not have to change. Ideally, you think it should change if you wrote it. And then A, which is like a crash bug or something critical. And it was the B bugs that were the ones that are most contentious, which was, the developers would be like, oh, that's as designed. Or,
Oh, we lost him.
Oh no.
He'll be back in a minute. Well,
There we go.
he's
I'm back.
Boom.
I'm back.
Okay, cool.
So anyway, so long story short was that we could just basically try and impress as a tester to the lead tester that we think this is a big deal and we'll show you why or tell you why. And if they valued that enough, they would then elevate that to the test manager. And if he valued that enough, you'd bring it to the producer who might just shoot it down. So it was really only if it was something that would be a legal issue or could really damage an IP if we're working with an IP like, Disney or Jurassic Park or something. Or like, no, you guys, this is a bug you really need to fix because it's going to cause negative reviews or other issues.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Nice one, mate. Nice one. Right. To Rick then. Rick's question next.
So, Eric, were there any Sega games that you would have liked to have worked on? Maybe there was some games around that you wanted to put your particular.
So this game right here, I'm trying to get it on a. You guys can see. It's kind of weird on my phone that it's backwards. So this is called Dimension Raiders, and this is a game concept I had in 1990, probably late 1995. And there was a point where Mike Latham, who was head of our team, the Omega team, we were called. They said, "Hey, they're looking at the slate of next Sega of America games. Pitch your games, pitch some product." And so the basic premise of this game called Dimension Raiders was, from the thematic story standpoint, was that you would grab like a multi-reality, which you think now we look like the Marvel movies and the comics back in the day. It's like a multi-universe thing. So you had like a robot world, and you had like monster world, like a vampire hunter. You had superhero world. You had like the barbaric kind of Conan type world, and that this character named the Seeker was grabbing these people from all these different places, like these chosen champions of your universe, and we need to go together and save each one of your universes because of this threat that was basically like a cancer was going to basically destroy each one of you and ultimately cause an imbalance and everything gets destroyed, right? So so the game was kind of an RTS, because back then like Command and Conquer and things were pretty hot. and mixed in with some role playing elements where you could upgrade your characters, and then also some free form kind of open world where you could choose whose world you go to first, which might affect kind of the type of challenge you have and experience. But it was well received from its artistic standpoint. There was actually a whole book that I don't have anymore that basically took all these characters and showed them being picked up in their different worlds. Not totally different than a Tour Champions in that, these guys are from different times. It's kind of similar in that way. But the problem was back then I was too green to think of it from really selling to the marketing team. They're like, yeah, RTSs are big, and yeah, this looks pretty cool, but we're not sure how well it's going to do. And for the Sega Saturn, which is what it was pitched for, we don't know if this is the right game for that. And nowadays I pitch things with business first in mind, and I sneak in all the creative and cool things for the player. So that's part of that package, right? So that still happens. And also the thing that killed this game more than anything was that was the time when Sega was starting to kind of decline, and the power level between Sega of Japan and Sega of America has changed drastically, right? Because for a while, Sega of America was doing better than Sega of Japan. And Sega of Japan was just kissing our ass. They're like, whatever you need, we'll green light this. We'll fly you guys to Japan. Like, okay, you guys are doing great. And then we started doing poorly. They treat us like crap. And this might be a good opportunity to tell you guys about Blazing Heroes, also known as Realms of Mystaria, because it's connected. I don't know if this is going to infringe upon a future question, but this is a good story, I think, so maybe I should share it. Yes?
Yeah, good for it, mate.
Okay. So a lot of times we would get these translations, and this goes back to, I think it might have been, is it Rich or Rick? It's Rich? Rick. That's right. So it might have been Rick's question was about the translations. Is that you, Rick? About yeah. So there is one way that it wasn't like a surprise, but a lot of times we would get these raw translations of stuff, and we would have to do our own, like, okay, that doesn't make sense, or it doesn't fit because the character size, right? We need to modify it. But those are all just kind of part of the process of localization, so that's not a problem. However, game came out. It was originally called Riglord Saga in Japan. Okay, and it was a really cool 3D role-playing game on the Saturn. I think it might have been the first one, but it was one of the first ones. And the raw translation of it was just garbage. And I don't know if the story was already just garbage, it didn't make any sense or not. So as a D&D guy, since I was 10 years old, I'm like, I can rewrite this and I can just swap in the text. And so I started doing that. And I made a big mistake. When you look back and you're like, oh, I have so much more experience, I should have laid my expectations down to Sega of Japan. Like, I'm going to rewrite pretty much all this stuff, but they're going to fit within the format. So all you got to do is just put my text in. And I guess there's some degree of work to swap in text, as you can imagine. And so what happened was I was rolling with it. I was spending lots of extra hours to get it done. I was pretty happy with it. I got about maybe 2/3 of the way through. And that was around the time when Sega of Japan had more power over us and were kind of treating us like crap. And Hasagawa-san, my liaison in Japan, is like, yeah, they said they're not going to do any more they're not going to do any more swapping. I'm like, you can't, this is bad because you have this one storyline going one way and then suddenly it just changes and it's just weird and garbagey. And they're like, yeah, sorry. And I went to Mike Latham, pled my case. He's like, sorry. And so what happens is, and if I could even send it to you later, Dan, but there's an article that still exists. There's a review of that game, and it says that it's a pretty solid game, X, Y, and Z. The story's pretty cool, and then it gets muddled towards the end. So they specifically called out the fact that the story gets fucked up at the end. And so so the reason I told that story, one, because it's kind of interesting, but also because it does talk about that power struggle and the differences with Japan and America and how that kind of affected things. So many stories you guys know, like if you think about like comic books, so many things are affected by, okay, you had all these guys that lived in New York with a lot of crime. And so they come up with the Punisher, and that, they had like these kind of things that are very specific to that time and the culture with civil unrest or whatever. And so with video games and anything else, there's always a story behind stuff. The political decisions, the the monies that are being exchanged hands and all these things. So yeah, so I'm sad about it, but it's an interesting story.
It's such a shame that, 'cause like I say, it's that type of thing. If they're picking it up and putting it out in reviews, then it can kill a game dead, can't it? So that is a real shame. That.
Yeah. My fault as a producer, because I produce, producer and designer, right? But as a producer, I always think, what could I have done differently? And again, set expectations.
Yeah.
If I get sign off from them, they can't pull it back.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but I didn't do that. I just started sending them over new text, so my bad.
Live and learn, mate. Live and learn, isn't it? So, right, Viraj, you're up next then, buddy.
All right. This is a fun question, I think. Did you have much of a say in the quality of music and sound that was put into these games? Did you ever get to meet the composers and talk about the sound of the music in these games? And would they take any criticism or feedback seriously? Would that be a thing?
Yeah. So for ones that I work directly on, right? Because some games, again, I would get them partially done, or I'd take them a certain point, and so I already have whatever I have. One thing you could always do, even from the test department in a small way, is like call out like there's a missing sound effect or a bad sound effect or a sound effect that's grating or plays too much. Like you can call it those things. But if it's a first party game, then you're either working with an internal composer or sound designer, or you've contracted one that you're talking to. And so you have a lot to say. For Eternal Champions, we worked with what I thought was a great composer, Tristan Dupree. He did both the Eternal Champions MIDI music as well as the Sega CD cool music for that game. And he was super fun to work with, and he was able to make all kinds of music styles and take advantage of whatever technology was. And a lot of times in the designs, you would call out, you'd have to list out, here's all the sound effects we need, and you would give examples. And a lot of times, because you can't just say, give me music. You have to say, here's some examples of what I like. Here's examples of what it should be, or here's what the theme is. And so you have a lot of say, and you get to talk to them. There were some composers that might be a little full of themselves, and so they kind of like, But as a producer, he had a lot of pull. Producers, that title, it depends on the era and the company. Like some producers are just basically keeping track of schedules. Some producers are in charge of the entire game. Some producers are also designers. Like it's all over back there. And then we had control over a lot of the aspects of the game. We were kind of the point person for the decision, except for our bosses.
All right. Thank you very much for that. That's really good.
Nice one, mate. Nice one. Well, my question next then, mate. What's your favourite aspects, or what were your favourite aspects of the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis itself as a system?
Yeah. So as an aside later on, I love the 6-button controller. But before that, I love the fact that, retrospectively, you look at it as just grabbing that cartridge, going slap, and then you're playing in like 30 seconds. Okay. The colors, I just love that color palette. Just always spoke to me. It's very vibrant, and as the many games that looked quite amazing on the Genesis. I like the processing speed, so you could have a lot of different, Sonic the Hedgehog and all these other games. Action was always fast and fierce. Streets of Rage played well on all that stuff, right? That you could really do a lot with it, and it was. The music and the sound effects even, and granted, is probably some nostalgia in me talking, but I still love all the music and the sound effects. I think it was just right. It was, some of the best that you could get on a 16-bit system. Again, that just might be being biased.
But I agree with you. I think all of us agree with you. We prefer FM synthesis, that type of music that system had. And I know there's the other 16-bit system that used sound sampling. But there's just something clean and crisp about FM synthesis that we really love. And it had some really good guitar synths. You had some really good bass on it. You had some really good compositions from great composers. So we agree with you.
Yeah, like all the stuff from the gentleman that was on Electric Playground for a long time. Come on, who's the most self-promoting composer in video games? Help me out. Tommy Tallarico.
Oh, Tallarico. Yeah.
So he did so many great things that they put on Genesis as well, right? Like Earthworm Jim and stuff.
Aladdin. Yeah,
exactly. And I can tell you stories about him later if you want to, because we did 2 interview/skits for Sega Soft later. That was a lot of fun, but we'll see where we get with our stories as we go.
All right.
Nice one. Nice. I believe you're up again next then, Viraj.
I'm up again next. Isn't
Yes,
it you,
mate.
mate? Let's have a look. Yes, it is me next. Did you? I'll ask this question better. Actually, it's written. So, did you ever meet any high ups such as Tom Kalinske, and what was he like? And what I mean by that is, as we know, there were conflicts later on towards the Mega Drive life cycle and the start of Saturn between Sega of America and Sega of Japan, and there's contradicting stories. That's always there in regards to what because there's the whole 32X thing and what went wrong around that, and Tom Kalinske said, okay, well they ordered me to make it from Sega Japan side. Is he? I mean, I'm like, what's the story? What happened?
Well, so I guess kind of a 2-part question, right? Because you're saying which higher ups might I have known, and then also what I know about the transition from to Saturn, as well as the extended systems like 32X. So the first one I know less about, but I've read about kind of like you. And a lot of it makes sense based on stuff that I saw that happened with like Eternal Champs for the Saturn and whatnot. I think Sega of Japan had a lot of decision making on all that stuff. And I think ultimately it just came down to like what happened with corporate heads just making bad decisions of what should they tackle, like do we keep milking the 16-bit and because people are buying less systems because we saturate the market, do we just buy add-ons so we can just keep kind of keeping people in that space? I do know, and I'm going to tell you more about Tom Kalinske because I've talked to him several times, and that's kind of the vibe that I got from him, that his hand was definitely kind of forced. And as well as, and this, I think the Sega Saturn coming out early was on our side, that we were trying to jump the market and get everyone excited at E3, but then that was its own problem. You guys know the basics of kind of the issues that happened with releasing that early, or no?
Yeah, I mean, so basically they launched it the day they announced it, and it committed suicide. I remember Tom Kalinske saying in the interview how Toys R Us and there was another retailer. There's only 2 retailers, and that was committing suicide because Tom Kalinske came from a marketing background, and all the other retailers hated them and didn't want to stock the Saturn afterwards. And eventually, it became a mail order item if you wanted one or something like that. And because of the limited supply they had on release, because the limited game software they had on release, because they were pressured to have that early release in '95, it backfired badly. Also, he said he went through all this thing on his little speech during that E3. And he was saying, okay, it's going to have this, it's going to have this, it's going to be $399. And then the Sony guy then comes on that podium and he just said, this is a Sony PlayStation, it's $299. He throws the piece of paper and walks off and everybody cheered. And that was the end.
Yeah.
And then Tom Kalinske after that, he resigned, sadly. Very sad.
Yeah. So now I don't know how much of that was just Tom as well, but certainly he was there. He was in charge. So he certainly greenlit that decision, because I know that there's like so Mike Ribeiro, but the head of our marketing department had a lot of power there, as well as like, oh, like this we need to do. But blame wise, I'm not going to really say it's not. But some of the other problems that came with that was that you had developers that were anticipating a launch date, and so they were working towards that launch date and saying, we want to be a launch title because there's less of us in the market and we're more likely to get bought up, and then we can catch that ride. So the game came out before they were done.
Right.
Secondly, you had, like you had mentioned, a small library. And so it's a limited library. It's not as attractive to people. It's like, oh, here's a bunch of arcade ports, right? That Japan thinks this is where I think that there's influence from Japan too, because they had to greenlit it from their side too, is that they were high on all of their AM2 stuff, right? Like Virtual Fighter and all those. Yeah. And so I think they thought, oh, these games are the shit. We're just going to release them and people are going to love our system. And that was to the detriment of everything that SOA was going to develop or wanted to develop for it. So that's kind of as much as I know. And it's a little muddled. I was at a time in my life and career where I was mostly with my face down working on games, sometimes interacting with execs, but not a lot. And so I'd find out later, or Mike Latham would tell me something, and I might not even pay that much attention because I'm just kind of doing what I'm doing. Now, to talk about people, I was lucky enough though to still, know Ed Annunziata, as I mentioned, Cindy Clavering is now Hardgrave. She was in charge of like the Pico and stuff. A lot of those kind of upper level guys, and then Tom Kalinske, he being as high as he was, I didn't meet him in person until 2016.
Wow.
I was working at a company called Gazillion, and they did the Marvel Heroes MMO, which I think is a tragically underrated game once you got it to the PlayStation 3 or 4. But neither here nor there. He was the chairman of the board on Gazillion, and he had an office about 20 feet from me. And so one day I walked up, knocked on the door, say if I could take a minute. I just want to say that I worked at Sega, and best time of my life. I loved watching all of your quarterly review meetings, and I love the way you spoke to Sega, and you were to me like the essence of Sega. If you think of like president of the country at a good time in the country, like that's what I think of. And he was so nice, because he's pretty old now, and he was just very genuine and gentle and humble and just super, super cool. I saw him again about a year ago. We had a Sega reunion. Dan, if you look back on some of my videos, you'll see some stuff we had there. But he was there again, and I walked up to him, and he kind of recognized me, but there's so many people there. And I just said, I didn't get to say this last time, but I just want to say, you're my hero. And he's like, I'm your hero. He's like, hugged me and stuff. We took pictures and stuff. He's like thrilled. Oh, thanks so much. But just a good guy. He's such a genuine person, full of integrity. He was not in any way a weasel. If he ever messed up, it was just some bad decisions, but certainly wasn't out of hubris or being selfish or power hungry.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that answer.
Sure.
Very interesting.
I think you could feel, to me, you could feel that vibe. It sounds crazy, but there's an old saying from the John Borman film Excalibur, and that's the king and the land are one. And basically, how you led filters through to your troops and filters through to what comes out. And you could feel that. You could definitely feel that in that early 90s Sega, because it felt very, everybody were really putting their heart and soul into it, and we're together, and that old vibe came through, mate. So you could tell.
Look, for better or for worse, my opinion is Tom Kalinske put Sega on the map in the West. Whether he made a few mistakes or not, he made Sega a giant, in the Western market, and put it on the map. And it's a shame what happened. It's happened. But the question is like, it's so ambiguous, because there's one different side of the story of what Sega of Japan says. There's what Tom Kalinske has to say in the High Score Netflix series, and how he worked with them. It's very interesting, and he's obviously there's various interviews on YouTube that he's done. So I just want to see what your thoughts were on. But thank you very much for your answer. Thank you.
Of course, yeah.
Well, that leads to my next question then. So, if you'd have been CEO of Sega of America, what type of things would you have tried to put in place and drive forward?
Probably just do nothing but porn games. So the three things that I would have loved to have done, and now this is also, by the way, looking back retrospectively, and not necessarily what I know back then. But one was embrace all of the SOA games that were good and continue those. Because something that I kind of alluded to earlier, that Sega of Japan, they wanted to really focus on their arcade ports, and also was not giving us kind of any leeway or respect. And so almost none of our games that were really popular on the Genesis ever saw sequels or kind of reimagined kind of versions. It was almost all Japanese games or these completely new games. And at the same time, aside from losing that audience and people that like they want to play, you know, like I said, Eternal Champions for the Saturn or something, that they also, I think, really changed their theme where they're trying to be like, wow, the Saturn is just so amazing and cool. And look at the, you know, this, what was that Knights game? It was pretty cool where you're floating around like
Knights of the Dreams.
Night in the Dreams.
Thank you.
Sonic Team.
Like-
Yeah.
So they're always just trying to like wow you. This is so amazing. It looks like an arcade game. So they're, I think, Sega of Japan's kind of marketing direction, and this is just me commiserating based on what I think I know, was that that's kind of what they're trying to sell, which is like, we're like the arcade and look at all these wow, amazing, pretty games and stuff, as opposed to like, we're cool and we're edgy, we're hip, which we lost all that. Like all that disappeared. And so I think that I would say let the SOA team, if they don't do the sequels, which they still should have, but also, you know, go for edgy, go for cool, kind of break some rules, try and be, kind of, I would say sarcastic, but just have a blast of a time. So I continue that kind of thing that made it so cool back then. And then lastly, it would have been cool to, I think, keep making Genesis games for a while. And I know that would not have kept them alive, but what that could have done is been a source of revenue and continue to kind of a Sega brand loyalty. Because, yeah, certainly a lot of people, almost everybody want to move on to the new systems. But, if there were some amazing games that came out on the Genesis back then, there could have been something there. There could have been like, oh no, dude, I'm still playing the Genesis 2 Tech. The Genesis game came out. Because you had a lot of teams back then that were absolute experts on the hardware and how to make games for those, and so that would have been a third revenue stream, to be clear. But I think the main thing was don't throw away all the SOA games, like let them continue, and then be more edgy. Those would be the two main things I would want to do.
Nice. Well, I mean, Eternal Champions, like I say, that's a game that to me always deserved a sequel.
Right.
So that's a perfect example of what you're talking about. And to extend your point there, I was actually, as a kid, I didn't like the next gen very much. And when I say didn't like the next gen very much, I didn't actually own a Saturn. My friend bought one before me because he was working. So I hung on and I got a PlayStation and N64, which I hated. Well, PlayStation was okay. PlayStation was cool. N64 was the worst console I've ever owned. Hated it. And a big part of that was because the initial shift to 3D was so bad. And I'd also got a PC which had some great 3D games on. When you got like Doom and Hexen and all that, I was used to playing that. So then going to 3D on a console weren't for me. So I would have loved to have seen the Mega Drive continue with that the mastered pixel 2D era, which we did see on Saturn. The Saturn has some fantastic stuff on that.
Yeah.
But I definitely think there was still a market for it, mate. Definitely.
Yeah. Well, good. It's good to hear that, at least would have sold some units to you. but
I'd have bought them all, mate. I'd have bought them all.
I'm being sarcastic. But like I said, I feel like the Genesis, it has such a huge following that, because the idea is, so what happens typically with a lot of companies, publishers, and especially the ones that make the hardware, when there's a shift of a new systems, like 16 to 32, 32 to 64, there's a big mess of things that happen. So the current systems sell less because people are anticipating the next system, and the next systems sell less because there's not as much hardware out there. And so whatever games you're making the systems for, you're going to make less money. And then the companies are trying to like sell enough hardware, if they make hardware, to continue to kind of thrive and pay all their bills and move up to that next level, while they still try and kind of keep the heartbeat on the old game. But a good example would be that the Game Gear and the games lasted for quite a while. Game Gear lasted well beyond like 32-bit and stuff. They were making those games, and so because those had an audience, I feel like Genesis could have as well. But ultimately, I wouldn't be surprised if the outcome eventually would have been the same, because Sony's got so much money, Microsoft has got so much money, and like right away, EA decided, oh yeah, we're not gonna make sports games for the Saturn.
Mm.
Or no, was it Dream? Yeah, Saturn, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's correct.
Yeah,
Mm.
and so that was like a nail in the coffin for a lot of Genesis players who love to play all the sports games.
Yeah.
And so, and they were like basically hedging their bets. And also there's some money on the back end about like how much profit was being shared and da 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 da. But so I don't know. I mean, would Sega survive anyway? I don't know for sure. We could have done better, that's for sure.
Mm.
Nice, mate. Very nice. Steve, you're up next, buddy.
All right. You kind of partially answered this question and some of the other questions. But during your years at Sega of America, did you feel like Sega of Japan were, in a sense, kind of going out of their way in order to stop Sega of America from releasing, the best products that they could have to the end consumer?
Right.
Maybe out of jealousy, internally from one organization to the other. Like they were kind of upset that they had done stuff that they didn't think was going to work, and it did work. And it almost made Sega of Japan, executives look bad. And maybe they harbored a little bit of animosity towards, Sega of America.
Yeah.
That's
so I can elaborate a little bit because like I have spoken to this a bit, but I sense that culturally, when someone else is doing better than you, you just bow your head and you basically admit that they're better than you, or that they deserve to get the lion's share of the support and credit and whatever. So I think that's why when I first got to Sega, when the money was rolling in and games were greenlit left and right, and we got what we wanted. But I would not be surprised if, because on the other side, I'm sure the Sega of Japan execs are like, why are the SOA guys doing better than you? What the fuck is wrong with you, right? And so that probably was always in their heads. And then as soon as we started doing poorly, they're like, all right, now we're going to lay the hammer down. Yeah. We're going to, even with greater emphasis, show we have no respect for you and that we're better than you. Right. And so, we're going to make the decisions now. Right. And so I think there's some of that. And then again, based on stuff that I've read and stuff, it feels just, again, it's like they're trying to make what they think is the best decisions, because ultimately they want to be a successful company. Right. Sure. So I don't think they did anything to shoot to spite their own, self. But I think that there was certainly a degree of jealousy, a degree of kind of backlash combined with bad decision making.
Thanks.
Sure.
Rick, you're up next, buddy.
So, did the job burn you out on video games in any way?
No. So I've been playing video games since I was 9 years old. I played Pong, and I have never stopped. That being said, what I did do is I got burnt out. I just burned out from probably 94 until around 99 or so. I worked a lot because, I always want to make the best product. And as a producer and often designer, a lot of the stuff is on me. And so if I don't balance it or add the details or make an adjustment or give the direction, the game's not going to be as good as it could be. And the end result was, some games I'm pretty proud of came out between, around those times. But lucky for me, I didn't have kids. I wasn't married at that time. But I was still like, wow, I spent a lot of my life working. And so now I try and work smart and not hard. And that seems to work just as well. You just got to learn, you got to figure out how to work smart. And also the culture back then was also kind of an expectation, which sucked. It's kind of like the movies probably are still now, was like, oh, you're working games development? Okay, it's crunch time. Like, fuck. So yeah, that's the only thing. It soured me from kind of getting beat up, and it's not good for you physically either if you're just like working all the time. So yeah.
From what you're saying about games development, not getting burned out on games, and your previous questions, I think Rick's going to apply for a job as a game tester pretty soon.
Yeah. Do it, baby. And if I can ever help any of you guys, let me know. You know, if there's stuff in your area or remote work or something, I might know somebody. So, yeah, it's different nowadays, of course, because the other cool thing about why I like Sega so much was, it was. Have you guys seen that brilliant video called "This Is Sega Test"?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that to me is just a gem because I had just finished working in test at that time. I'm the guy kicking the pads out in the parking lot. That was me. And so, but all those people I worked with, they have the 90s style haircuts. They have the lip rings. Granted, people have them again now, but I mean, it was such a 90s microcosm. And the type of people, like these are guys like they smoke pot, they come into work, they work, they go to the parking lot at break, smoke pot, go back in, and they're like just fun and they're irreverent. It's like a big sitcom, and there wasn't all this like corporate stuff like, you know, everything's just nailed down and everything's decided at the highest level of people that aren't connected to games. Like it was such an exciting time, and I completely went off on a tangent. I don't even know where I started this. Oh, about testers. So it's just that it's different now in that back then you could be a tester and hope to be a producer or hope to get into marketing from test. And you kind of can, but usually you're coming in as a temp, and you're probably going to get booted in 6 months or a year because of contracts or their budget or something. But there's still a way in, you know, there's always a way in. But yeah, I definitely would not dissuade anybody from making video games and be a part of any part of it, except for the thing I would say, make sure that you understand that you don't get to make the decisions, because at some point, if you're passionate about your product, you're going to get your heart broken a few times before you realize like, oh, okay, they canceled this game, or an executive came in and totally derailed it, or a lead engineer on a boxing game that I'm working on won't implement this very important combo system that's going to hurt our reviews. And that did happen to me. And so those type of things that you deal with, that you, once you set aside, you say, okay, what do I have power over? What can I enjoy? And then you affect that part of it. And then it's super fun.
Cool.
Nice. Actually, that Sega test video, quite a few people, I shown it to them, and they all commented on how good looking. Is it Jeanette or Jean was?
Janine Cook. Yeah. So she was
Janine
one of my good friends there. So her nickname was the Ferret.
Right.
That's because she had this kind of like swan-like neck. And my best friend, Harry Chavez, used to give everybody nicknames. I could do an entire episode talking about Sega test. It was like Seinfeld or something. It was like a big sitcom. But she was in one of the offices with me. There's four of us sharing an office. There was me, Chavez, Janine, and a guy named Mark Paniagua. And she was super fun. She never got in the industry after that. She's now a DJ. She has been for a long time. And I talked to her on Facebook, you know, probably once a week or something. Still a pretty lady. And she's, you know, probably around 50 now. Yeah. So, but yeah, she was awesome. She was sweet. She was pretty. She was fun, and had a good sense of humor.
Sweet, nice one, mate. Well, moving on to my next question then, bud. How were the feelings within the company and with yourself towards Nintendo? And was there any actual because there's obviously all the banter, but were there actually any genuine hatred or disdain from you or the Sega staff?
I would say almost for sure no. A lot of us played, you know, Nintendo games, Sony games, partially competitive product, partially because they're excited to play it. And so, no, I think, you know, really it was more of like the highest level. Like when I was in test, I remember we loved kicking Nintendo's butt because, you know, they had all the limelight and they had Mario and blah, blah, blah. But we're these scrappy upstarts with Sonic and we're cool. So it's more of a competition, but I don't think anybody, like from a personal perspective, as I mentioned earlier, I'm just less drawn to them because most of the Nintendo games tend to be cute. And so I was like, no, give me something grittier, give me something kind of cooler. But that was just my kind of personal preference. But no, we did not hate those companies, except for the fact that they might take our jobs away like Sony did.
Fair enough. Good answer, mate. Good answer. Rick, you're up with another buddy?
How do you feel about Sega today?
Retrospectively, or what Sega's doing now?
Maybe just your thoughts and feelings on the company in general, the direction they've gone, and your opinion of it.
So, Valkyrie Chronicles is one of my favorite games,
Oh,
and I even played it on like the PSP. I think it was one of the worst they had on, um, and so I like the fact that they're still making games. That's pretty cool. I don't know enough about their decision making and who's in charge. It would be great. I know they've done some Sega, some Sonic games. I assume that was them, right? Like they published those. I assume they didn't outsource. So, but what I would love to see more, because like we know now, and again, I'm preaching the choir. Streets of Rage 2, the Ninja Turtles, like all these retro games are coming back. Like, bring them back, remaster them, make them better with cooler features, online play, blah blah blah. It feels to me like and I wouldn't be surprised that if there is a few games already being developed that we don't know about, but I would lean into the coolest games that we had, or maybe the ones that had most potential that didn't really get their chance, and bring those to the next gen consoles, but in a 16-bit look, with the other things to make it look less 16-bit, if that makes sense. Oh, and that I loved working back then, right? So again, it was like magical time in my life for sure. I came from, again, working in a grocery store. I was maybe going to open up a martial art dojo, and that was going to be my thing. That was it. And then like the whole world exploded, and I'm with Daisy Fuentes at the Alcatraz Island filming Rock the Rock on MTV for Sonic the Hedgehog 2. I'm at Prince's nightclub because I got tickets because I work at Sega. Like, it's everything is like, I would have people go, "Oh, that game you worked on is so amazing." Like, Sega is just such a big part of my life. I'm super thankful that I got in there.
That's great. That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about it before, just with the retro stuff, and I'm a massive. I think Sega are missing a huge opportunity with these franchises that have got sat doing nothing, because Streets of Rage 4 sold, I think, 2.5 million copies within a year, I think it was. And when you look at the games like Yakuza, they don't really sell that much more, but they cost a hell of a lot more production-wise. Yeah. And I'm sat there thinking, why aren't we seeing Shining Force, Phantasy Star, Streets of Rage, all these fantastic retro titles, all still boosted out there, which I'm sure they've got the reasons. I'm sure there's business guys driving all shareholders and everything like that. But for me as a player, I'm like, I know a lot of lads who would buy it, I'd buy it. It shouldn't cost that much to produce. A lot or indie studios out there, you could get to produce it, do it. So
I mean, we saw this with Sonic Mania and Sonic Forces, and Sonic Mania was made by I forget his name, but he's Christian Whitehead, and his little thing that he did, and he created it. Obviously, we know that less money was poured into that, and it probably generated more sales and revenue than Sonic Forces did. It probably cost Sonic Forces market as a AAA title, but it probably didn't do as well. So
I mean, so I think this speaks to a couple things, and again, like the culture, what's going on nowadays between, monetization and people counting beans and metric guys and all that stuff, and people not connected to games, making decisions. I think it's a little bit harder to kind of get those. You see the right people in the right places, because like if I was working at Sega and I push that and I'm getting pushed back, I say, hey, you know what? Some companies have done crowdfunding for a sequel for a game, like I'm trying to think which one it was, but there's one that recently did it, and they did really well. They did crowdfunding for a sequel for a game, and got all the money it needed, and the game was super popular. I'll have to send you a link later when I figure out who the hell it was. But why couldn't Sega do the same thing? Let's crowdfund an Eternal Champions, let's crowdfund, a Shining Force or whatever, because there's all you need is just the person to manage it, and the pre-pro team. Because here's the thing, when you want to get a game crowdfunded, if you just wave your hands and show pictures, that's harder. If you say, hey, here's some guys that made these games, and oh, hey, here is a demo of the game, give us, $4 million or $50 million or whatever, depends what the project was. I think those things could happen.
Yeah.
So, but we're all saying the same thing, which is just that there's a missed opportunity. And I'm hoping that we just don't know about some things that are happening. You know, maybe somebody is wising up and making something like that.
Nice one, mate. Nice one. Viraj, you're up next, buddy.
At the risk of repeating myself, because this question has been answered, I'm going to rephrase this question. All right, I'm going to give a summary of what it is. So basically, I'll tell you what the question was anyway. It was, what direction would you like to see Sega go towards in future, in what is now a very competitive, saturated market? But look, just to summarize, look, we know Sega are out of the console game. It's just too competitive. We know they've been squeezed out. We know that they've got this. They've got their studios that they're working on, and they're known as Sega Sammy now, and they're doing what they got to do. There's also their intermediary strategy, which is these mini consoles that they're bringing out to obviously show that they're relevant out there and that they care about their legacy. So there is that aspect, which I really love. And there's mobile gaming, which is something that they've put their finger in. They bought Rovio recently. I don't know if you saw the news for like some billion, a couple of billion. The Angry Birds developer, they bought that at the board. So obviously they're going to try and develop more for the mobile market. But I mean, Sega as a brand obviously isn't as big as it once was, sadly. You know, you got bigger developers out there that have come out and emerged and done really well with their IPs. But I think we've partially answered this question, which is to resurrect some of their IPs from the past and probably make them relevant and make them work. As we answered. But where would you like to see Sega to go in a direction? Obviously, I've said all this stuff here, but what else something I haven't said, which you'd like to add to what I've said?
Yeah, I guess just maybe one thing that might be worth adding would be, because they could do like a test market in this, or they could get experts to kind of guesstimate on what they could make. But like a re-release, not just the Sega Minis, but a re-release of the Mega Drive's Genesis, with a whole new slate of games at the same time, with other things that make it like appealing to people. Whatever it be, the technology that you don't have to plug in anything, or whatever bits they make to make it easier. That might be an interesting thing to research, because I would certainly do it. I would certainly buy one, because wow, this is sounds that I remember, but then little upgrades to it, so that whatever things that were not super appealing about it, like, oh, the music's even better, the sound's even better, the processing power is even better, but it's still, in essence, it's still a Genesis, or a Mega Drive. That would be interesting to me. We've already touched upon the other stuff. I mean, ultimately at this point, and I'm a huge optimist. Like, I'm always about like trying to find solutions to be successful and make things work. But I think that the fact that they're just around as a software developer is a win to me, and that there's always potential there. And if they can make the occasional Valkyrie Chronicles or the Persona 5s or whatever, that's pretty cool. And hopefully the stuff that we've mentioned, some of that might happen.
Thank you very much for your answer.
I genuinely feel that if they were to release essentially a Genesis 2, which would probably be somewhere around the Saturn mark in terms of 2D power, and make it that 2D powerhouse of that era, if they could do it right, make it, get around pirating issues and make it backwards compatible. Because the other thing is, it's like all these chaps here and my good self, we all buy retro games. We spend a lot of money on them. You know what I mean? We spend a lot of money. Like, people will spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds on one game if it's a game they're after. So if they can get that, if Sega can reproduce that for a newer console, if you buy a console, an old game that you've been after that costs several £100s, you can get that for like a third of the price, if not less. You're going to buy it. And then if you're going to get other wicked games on top of that, you're going to get it, aren't you? So, like you say, you think they'd at least research it anyway. And
imagine like the possibilities, for example, that, like the tagline or the mantra would be, we're going to re-release all of the old games, but every single one of them has a little something extra. More levels, another character, an extra mode, like, and plus it's everything you ever remember, and, a save game or something. But there's potential, and like I said, the cool thing is that they still exist, and so who knows what's going to happen. But I'll tell you, I mean, I bring up Sega now to people that are in their 20s, and they go, "Oh yeah, I remember Sega, or I heard of Sega." So they at least have a brand recognition, but of course they're nothing like they used to be, which is great, because you think like, people go, "Oh, you remember 3DO?" They're like, "What?" So so they definitely have a good place in people's hearts, and they have a good reputation. Even if people haven't played their games, they still know of Sega.
Nice one, mate.
Yeah.
Nice one. Steve, your final question, please, Chief.
All right. If you had a time machine and weapons grade plutonium in your flux capacitor, and you could go back and you could change anything about any of the games that you reviewed or tested when you were working for Sega, would you? And why would it be the hit detection in Cyborg Justice?
Yeah, I did actually test that game, and I was in charge of hit detection. No, just kidding. So that game had a lot of issues. The biggest thing to me with that game was just that it was made by people that didn't really understand what's cool about a fighting game. So it's just a lot of like one shot clunky, like bang, bang, bang with each other. And, but yeah, I mean, certainly there's been games like Jurassic Park famously has a lot of like collision detection issues with like landing on platforms and things, and other issues like shooting enemies or getting killed off screen or whatever. But I think most of the games, they were just tested a little longer and got most of those things fixed. The ones that actually I didn't work on, but I lament, was ones that were kind of politically driven decisions of, like, for example, the first Joe Montana football. And this, by the way, is nothing that I knew back then. This is stuff that I've seen in videos and read. But essentially, they wanted to have their own competitive game, and they didn't. The developer they went with didn't know what the H they were doing, even though I just said fuck 50 times, and then now I'm saying H, but they didn't know what they're doing, and so they ended up having to buy a worse version of Madden core engine from EA to make their own football game. And so it's stuff like that where, like that game is like a subpar version of Madden because what I just said. But for ones that I've worked on, I'm pretty happy with what the test department was able to do based on the hours that we had, and that we found pretty much all the bugs. Like nothing ever was not known. And then it goes back to my thing earlier in our interview, which was we only had so much say. Almost every game you work on, if the deeper in you are, you're more kind of a part of this. You're like, oh, if only we were able to tune that, add that feature, put this thing in here, fix that one thing. You have like the game that you wanted, and there's always something. Usually it comes down to schedule. That's like the number one thing, because marketing is already ahead of you. You have your earnings, and so ship it. That's almost every game's like that, and that's why Eternal Champions, and luckily for me, a couple of the boxing games I worked on, those were released, I think, pretty good quality. But most of them you have to cut corners, and that also includes fixing some bugs. Right? You're like, we're gonna have to do known shippable. That's how you identify it. It's a known shippable, which means we're not gonna effing fix it, right? So.
Got you.
Nice, mate. Nice one. So, last question then, Chief. What's the wildest things that you can tell us about that occurred when you're at Sega? So, like any parties, dwarf tossing, Wolf of Wall Street type stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll let you guys choose. So I have a list of different things that have happened, and Dan probably knows most of them from like Arcade Attack and things. But so I almost got shot by another coworker. I was assaulted by a French stripper. We played crazy pranks in test department. I was telling about the electric playground, filming those kind of skits that we did. Those are some memorable bits in there. We had somebody who was in test that was murdered outside of test, and we have someone in test that was a Satan worshiper that later offed himself. So if any of those stories are interesting, let me know. I'm sure there's more in there. I was there for 6 years, but any one of those things, I mean, there's all kind of crazy stories. They're not connected to the business aspect, but they're connected to Sega.
I have heard a few of those. I've not heard the French stripper one.
How did I know you were going to ask that question? How did I know it was going to happen?
And have you still got a number? No, go on.
Yeah. So basically in 1997, I think. So Mike Latham, who was again head of Omega Group and had a lot of pull at Sega, he would be able to lift his entire team and take us to England to see the English developers, and probably need to bring everybody. But he'd do it anyway. And then he would also double it up as like a tour. Maybe go to a castle or do things like, I don't know if you guys have been to England, it was pretty cool. And so in this case, we were doing a thing. We went to England and we took the Channel to France. And that in itself was pretty cool, because the Channel I think it was just maybe like a year before or something. Do you guys know what year the Channel was built?
It was well, I'd say 96. Would it be?
Okay, yeah. See, so it was like a year later, yeah. Which in that way is kind of creepy, because I'm like, I hope there's not leaks they haven't discovered yet, and then get buried in the ocean. But anyway, this is the long form story to get you there. So we're in France, and France was completely just a tourist thing. We didn't have any developers there, and so one of the things Mike said, hey, you guys want to go on? It's called a sex tour, but basically it's like you go to strip clubs and watch a show and things. It's moderately mild, depends on what's mild to you or not. So one of the things we went to was a strip bar at a gentleman's club, and but it's obvious that the people doing the tour were probably paid by these people, because it was like really a bad quality. Walked in there, you could just tell immediately, oh, this is like one of those seedy places you don't want to be in, even if you're seedy. And so the thing was that, and again, especially nowadays in 2023, you want to be respectful. Let's just say that none of the girls that I saw were in any way, shape, or form my type, and really neither of my type for my friends either. And so what we do though is they sat you in this kind of like a circular, everyone's sitting down like this couch, just like a circular. It's right next to the stage, and so that way the strippers could be close to you, and they could probably come in there and sit in your laps or whatever. And so this one girl, she was on the big side, and the thing I remember most about her was she'd do these moves and go like that's whoa, it's like she's casting a spell or something, or what's going on, and I don't know, she's possessed, but it's weird. And so then of course they're trying to get our attention and get our tips and whatever, and she comes towards me, backs her caboose against my head, and starts bashing my head with it. And because she's so big, and my coworkers are there, and I'm kind of stuck between my coworkers, my head's going like this. And they were just dying. So
you could have put her in that as a move in Eternal Champions too.
Yes, that would be
retrospect.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Eternal already shipped. Otherwise, the stripper booty attack would be in there. But yeah, these are great things, because you can commiserate with your friends and laugh about them. Like, oh, I remember that thing that happened. So, but yeah, so that's how I was assaulted by a French stripper.
Nice one, mate. Nice one. We'll save your other stories, because we'd love to have you back, mate. Obviously,
sure.
We've kept you here for long enough. If you want to give a plug to your stuff, feel free, mate. Go for it.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm about to start a contract that's under NDA, so I can't really talk about that. But it's still video games, and it's pretty exciting. So as we stay in contact, Dan and I have kind of more concrete stuff that I can ever share, I will. Aside from that, I have a local kickboxing gym that will not matter to your viewers unless they live in San Mateo. But one thing I would like to share. So in addition to doing live stream cosplay Dungeons and Dragons, which I'm not going to bother sharing, I'll just say it's called Dress to Quest. Okay, you can look it up. But mostly I've started a fantasy / Dungeons and Dragons pun channel on TikTok. It's called Dad Jokes and Dragons. And right now it's in beta. And for those of you guys that are listening that don't know what beta is, that means we're still developing it, but I've already put it out there for about a month. It's had really good feedback. I have a lot of people likes and follows. And in about 2 weeks, we're going to have, in addition to me cosplaying as this character Volk the Grey, who does a lot of puns, My daughter comes in, also cosplays and plays off me, and then we have these really cool drawn backgrounds that fit, because right now it's just a green screen. But if you like puns, if you like dad jokes, and especially if you also like D&D, then it's going to be your thing. And it's on TikTok, tiktok.com/@dadjokesanddragons, or just go to TikTok if you have it and look up Dad Jokes and Dragons. That's it. I'm planning on to keep that thing going. We just filmed 5 months worth of content, and so we're going to be around for a little bit and kind of see what comes of it.
Nice one, mate. And I'll back Eric up there. I've seen quite a few of these beta runs of Dad's. Oh, I can't say it. Of the tongue twister thing, and it is really good. It's that lovely line of cringy but really funny, and I love it, mate. So fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming on, mate. I've really enjoyed that. Been brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve, Viraj, and Rick, for your great questions.
Thank you.
Superb show. We'll hopefully have you back again sometimes, Eric. And look after yourself, everyone. So
sounds awesome. Thank you.
Cheers,
guys.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.